Hello, I'm Bill Goodman, Executive Director of Kentucky Humanities. Welcome to the 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online. We're pleased you've taken the time to join us for this special program that brings together authors, readers, and literary enthusiasts from across the country and the Commonwealth, just like we've done for 39 years. All of our Kentucky Book Festival conversations would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Today, the University of Pikeville is bringing you Healthy at Home, Appalachia Then and Now. Sit back and relax and enjoy this discussion with Chris Hamby, Eric Eyre, and Ben Westhoff in conversation with author Michele Morrone. Thank you all for being here. Take it away, Michele.
Thanks, Bill. Today, I'm happy to moderate a panel with authors of 3 books that tell similar stories about the public health impacts of really important issues in Appalachia. We're going to start by talking to an author that looks at a global view of a drug abuse, substance abuse problem. The book is called Fentanyl Ink, and it actually takes a look at fentanyl and other novel psychoactive substances from a global perspective. And it takes us around the world and specifically into China to take a look at and help us understand how these novel psychoactive substances, or NPS, are being introduced into the United States and affecting our public health. So first of all, I'd like to ask Ben if he could share with us a little bit of his journey to get to writing the book and what sparked your interest in this specific topic.
Thanks, Michele. I had a friend who died from fentanyl about 10 years ago, back before anyone had really heard of fentanyl. And he died from an overdose using the patches. Fast forward to a few years back, I was writing a story about why so many people were dying at raves and these big electronic music festivals where people were dying every single one of these festivals, 1 person, 2, 3, and they were often reported to have died from ecstasy. But I knew that pure ecstasy is not really a very dangerous drug, and so I started investigating, why are people really dying? And it turns out that there was almost no pure ecstasy or MDMA to be had in most of these pills. They were all cut with these new drugs that you just referred to, NPS, novel psychoactive substances, which basically refers to any drug you haven't heard of before. They used to be called designer drugs. They're almost all made in China, and they are all synthetic, which means they're made in a lab, as opposed to drugs like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, which come from natural plants. And so the more I investigated these new drugs, I found out there was one, fentanyl, which was killing more people than anyone else. And in fact, nowadays, fentanyl kills more Americans annually than any drug in history. And so that set me on my quest.
I was really interested in the parts of your book where you did discuss raves. I have 2 grown children, and I hear, and I work in a university, and I hear young adults talking about raves, but boy, was I naive. Your book really helped me understand what is actually going on at these events. Your book also really goes into detail about the chemistry behind these NPS, and because you're an investigative reporter, I was really curious as to how you educated yourself about the chemistry, and then how you wrote it, how you were able to write about the chemicals in such a way that anyone who picks up the book can understand what you're explaining.
I appreciate your saying that, and it was very important to me not to be too jargony, to sort of write in a language that the readers could understand. And I spoke with experts, and I'm not afraid to admit when I don't know something. And I really tried to explain why these drugs were made in China, and that goes to the question of the chemistry, because fentanyl was actually banned in China a long time ago, but there were all these drugs called analogs, which were still legal. Now, an analog is basically where they take the chemical structure of a drug and they just tweak it very slightly. So in the case of fentanyl, they have carfentanil and sufentanil and, literally hundreds of other types. A lot of them do basically have the same effects as fentanyl, but because the chemical structure is just slightly tweaked, they became legal. And that's the basis of how this whole problem started.
And you bring up China, and I think there was a lot of compelling components of your book, but the work that you did undercover in China was, it was almost like reading a spy novel when I was reading that section. How you infiltrated Chinese manufacturers, and when you were putting that together, can you talk a little bit about the experience of putting that together, and then what you went through when you got to China and met the people that were responsible for producing these drugs?
Well, I knew that I was going to have to go to China for this book because, like I said, all these drugs were being made there, and there was almost nothing written about this industry. We know a lot about places like Mexico, where the cartels are making and distributing most of these American drugs, Colombia, Afghanistan, but people didn't think of China as a major drugs producer. So what I did was I started by just Googling buy drugs in China, and all these websites came up from companies that weren't even trying to hide what they were doing. They had their salespeople's emails and phone numbers, their social media contact information right there on the clear web. And so I began contacting them and asked if I could visit their lab if I came to China. And some of them said yes. I got on the plane, and I was initially really worried about not having the proper visa because I didn't want to get a journalist visa because I knew the Chinese government wouldn't let me do what I wanted to do. So I had a regular tourist visa. I was worried that I, could be put in jail for that. But that part went okay. I ended up meeting with some different lab chemists who kind of vetted me before eventually one took me to his lab. I was expecting guys with AK-47s guarding the door, a real sort of underground kind of sketchy facility, but it wasn't like that. It was a suburban office park where this office was located, where it was, you needed your key card to get past the parking lot arm. And the other company that I infiltrated, which was in Wuhan, back before anyone was familiar with Wuhan, had hundreds of salespeople on this big floor of their office. And these were all young, recent college graduates who were hired for their skills with English. And they were sitting in front of computers, making cold calls, emailing people, and basically functioning just like a Western office, all selling some of the most dangerous chemicals that are out there.
And I think that gives us a good connection to turn to Eric for a few minutes, because after I read all three books, I saw the connection between the three. And whereas your book talks some about distribution, Eric's book really goes into distribution, specifically in local communities in Appalachia. So Eric, I want to turn to you for a few minutes and ask you to talk a little bit about the motivation for your book, and how you decided to take the approach of looking at how drugs are distributed in local areas in West Virginia.
Yeah, Michelle, there really hadn't been much coverage of the distributors. There have been some great books like Dope Sick by Beth Macy, Painkiller by Barry Meyer, Dreamland by Sam Quinones. So we tried to focus on the distributors, and just so the people listening know what they are, these are large companies, large corporations that ship the drugs from the manufacturers to the pharmacists. Well, usually goes to a warehouse first, and then from the warehouse to the pharmacies and to the hospitals. And the story mostly focuses on what they call the big three, and these corporations, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health. I didn't know it at the time when I first started covering this, but found out later that they're among the largest corporations in America. McKesson and AmerisourceBergen are both in the top 10 on the Fortune 500. I mean, everybody knows Walmart, everybody knows Apple, Exxon, but all of a sudden, you got this McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and I don't think many people, until all these lawsuits happened, there's more than 3,000 lawsuits now, knew much about them. But they're just these enormous companies, and in this case, they were putting profits over people. It was sort of unfettered shipments of massive amount of quantities of drugs. In particular, what happened in West Virginia was that they were shipping massive amounts of painkillers to small town pharmacies that could not anywhere near support or have any rational reason that they were getting so many drugs.
And at one point, you note in the book about the distribution of narcotics in small towns and rural areas, and you explicitly state that this should have set off what you refer to as red flags, but it didn't. And I wonder, based on the research that you did for the book, if you think there's something unique or different about rural areas that contributed to the lack of these red flags being set off.
Yeah, I mean, not only not red flags being set off, but of course there was red flags that were set off that were ignored. You had cases where at the distributor in particular, there was a distribution warehouse in Washington Courthouse, Ohio, and some of the warehouse workers were notifying the higher ups that, in this case it was McKesson, that there was an extraordinary number of pills going into some of these small towns in West Virginia, and then nothing was done. As far as being a rural place, people always ask me, and the hardest question I get is, did the drug companies target the drug shippers target these rural areas? I don't know if it was necessarily targeting, but what I say is, after they started seeing the profits they were making there and the appetite for their prescription painkillers, OxyContin and Lortab or hydrocodone were the two main ones. They just turned on the spigot. They had gotten warnings from the DEA that this was going to be a problem, and this was a problem. They set up some thresholds where they would say, we're only going to ship 8,000 OxyContin to XYZ pharmacy per month, and then the pharmacy would complain. Sometimes they'd send a team to the pharmacy and say, is everything okay here? Sign this form and say that yes, there's a legitimate need for these drugs, and they would. So again, I'm not sure they targeted the rural population, but once they saw there was such a demand, they were more than willing to fill that demand.
And one of the other things that I think your work shares with Ben's work specifically is really looking at the role of legitimate corporations, right? Corporations that have stockholders or that are considered legitimate by the governments under which they operate. So I wondered if you had a few comments on the role of maybe capitalism and profit motivation as being one of the underlying reasons for the distributions that you uncovered in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a case of capitalism run amok. On the ground level, you had pharmacists, doctors who were probably making, 70 to $80,000 in rural America. And then when they started realizing they could set up these pain clinics, then all of a sudden they were making $1 million a year. We had pharmacists in a small town in Kermit, West Virginia, population 400. He was probably making $500,000 a year profits. And then there was court records that showed he had jumped up to $7 million a year. So you have him making money. You have, so if you have pharmacists making millions, you have the drug distributors making billions and the manufacturers making billions. And you also have the lobbyists that were lobbying to make it easier for this massive flow of pain pills to come to rural America.
And then you have the lawyers, and that's the connection, one of the connections I see
Yeah.
between your book and Chris's book, in that you both talk about the same law firm in your book.
Not only the
Uh,
same law firm, but I read about 3/4 of the way through Chris's excellent book, and even some of the same people show up in my book and in his book. The exact same lawyers. I mean, not just the same law firm, but the same lawyers. That particular law firm, Jackson Kelly, has a history of sort of being on the wrong side of history, in my opinion, at least, protecting major corporations, protecting major coal companies like Massey Energy.
Yeah, so let me segue over to Chris then, and talk a little bit about your book, Chris, and I'll come back to the question about the law firms, but you know, your book focuses on a specific public health issue, and that's black lung disease. And you know, as I was reading the book, I was, and with all of your books, this book in particular, I was getting so angry while I was reading the book that I just couldn't imagine maybe what you were going through while you were writing this, because it seemed like you got really close to a lot of the people that you were writing about. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the highs and lows that you experienced while you were writing it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this was more than the average story that I've worked on, one with a lot of emotional resonance to it. And it's very, I did the original stories. I've been reporting on coal mining and black lung disease since really early, around 2011. And some of the people in the book I met around 2012 or 2013, and I've really been, in touch with them since then. And I've seen people go through incredible struggles, and some of the people die who I've been following through this. And it has, when you work on something this long, you have to be motivated, and there has been no shortage of motivation for me on this. And sometimes when it has gotten frustrating or felt like an endless process, it's worthwhile for me to think about what some of these miners who are not only worked 30, 35 years in the mines and then got sick, and all they're asking is for modest compensation and medical coverage for this deadly disease that they've contracted through no fault of their own. And they have put up with so much more than I ever could imagine. And so it's really been a pleasure to get to know them, and it's been the best part of working on this book.
Right, and going back to the law firm that both you and Eric write about, I found it so curious in this book, especially, that the people who seem to be the most the activist people who want to really get in and do something and help the miners are not really hometown people. They're not necessarily from the region. And the law firm that was representing the coal companies and fighting against the miners' benefits has this long storied history in the region. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on why that is in this case.
Well, a number of the people who are the key people in the book, including one of the two main characters, John Klein, who is, he comes from upstate New York, and eventually comes to the coalfields as a Vista volunteer as part of the War on Poverty in the 1960s, and ends up staying. And there are a number of people who followed that route. So yeah, I think that in the 60s and 70s, there certainly was a draw to Central Appalachia that attracted a lot of people, young professionals who had a real sense of sort of a moral calling to do something. And I think there was a lot of, attention paid to Appalachia as part of the War on Poverty on that. But I don't want to shortchange the great work of the people who are from Appalachia, and I try and get into, try and detail their stories in many parts of the book. And there are, these are clinic workers, lay advocates, and the miners themselves, in many cases, have been the strongest advocates for their own self-interest, even against, even when they did not have the support of, at times in the 60s, even their own union, but certainly the medical and political and legal establishments. And so, I don't want to discount the incredible courage that they've shown.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And a lot of times, I read a lot of Appalachian, stories about Appalachia, and it seems like, the overarching narrative a lot is the struggles that people face rather than the triumphs and what they've overcome, what people in the region have overcome. So I appreciate you, emphasizing this. But I did read with interest, Paul Wheeler, who was the doctor affiliated with Johns Hopkins University, and was a key expert for against the miners. I really read with interest the part in the book where he pretty much dismissed Appalachian physicians, and that he was almost touting himself as a better physician because he wasn't from the region. And I imagine you came across that quite a bit in the research that you did. And I wonder how the people you worked with, the miners you worked with, if they had any perspective to share with you about that, about how they feel that they're viewed outside of the region.
Yeah, there's definitely, that was one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, and why I pursued writing this lengthy narrative, even after writing a long series of articles about the subject back in 2013, was that there is sort of the stereotype of people in Appalachia, and coal miners in particular. And I, wanted to sort of blow up that stereotype and show, how complex and smart, really. It may not be traditional, formal education type of display of it, but mining is a very difficult job. And I think that a lot of times in these benefits cases, what I saw were they turn heavily on expert opinions. And so you had cases where experts like Dr. Wheeler at Johns Hopkins, because of their credentials and their impressive resume, were able to have an outsized impact on these cases. And this was something that I think a lot of miners found incredibly frustrating and condescending. But it was something that was ultimately has been addressed to some degree.
So one of the things that all three of the authors did really well, I think, in these three books, is bring a real human element to the narrative. And I guess I'll go back to Ben and then ask Ben a question and ask all three of you to respond to it. Ben, then Eric, then Chris, and I just want to understand and get your perspective on how important you think it is to include that human element. All of you met people who were, affected by the issues that you were writing about, and maybe even talk about how you found the people to talk to and why you highlighted certain situations, family situations, or individuals. So I'll go back to you, Ben, and ask you if you want to talk a little bit about how important you think it is to incorporate that human element.
One really underrated aspect driving the opioid epidemic, I think, is shame. And this idea that drug users are bad people, and even to another extent that drug dealers are bad people, and that they deserve punishment, or really they deserve what's coming to them. And I think that's gradually starting to change, but we still have a long way to go. And part of my goal with Fentanyl Ink was to tell people's stories, people who suffered from fentanyl addiction, people, how people got to this point and how difficult it can be to get past it. One of the people I highlighted was a St. Louis drug dealer who I call Jack Sanders, and that's where I'm from, St. Louis. And he grew up in the suburbs. He seemed to have most of the advantages, but he fell into a heroin addiction, and it got so bad that he started working with a former high school classmate who was dealing heroin and fentanyl, and his pay was all the heroin he could use. And he was there when the Mexican cartels sort of introduced fentanyl into the ecosystem, and he was selling it on the streets. Started cutting fentanyl into heroin because fentanyl is so much cheaper and it's so much more powerful that it's a cost-saving device. And basically, they started putting more and more fentanyl into the heroin, and nowadays on the streets you're seeing mostly all fentanyl. With this guy Jack, he explained how he lost his moral conviction because he was so overtaken, and a lot of times it's not even just the drug's chemical hooks, it's the environmental factors, it's the your employment situation, it's trauma in your past. And what's important for us to realize is that when the economy is better, when people have jobs, when people's mental and physical health is really being addressed, that's as big a component to fighting drug addiction and drug overdose deaths as anything else. And I think it's important to show that.
I think one of the real takeaways that I got from what you were writing is, I think you said it at least once, you might have said it a couple of times, that we treat substance abuse as a crime rather than a disease. And it seems like that is, it's going to take a change in public perception of substance abuse to make more inroads into solving this problem.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to some of the rhetoric right now is that, well, we're going to give the drug dealers treatment, but we're going to put the drug users treatment, but we're going to put the drug dealers in jail. And the problem with that is that so many of the drug dealers are just addicted users themselves who are dealing to pay for their own habits. And the problem is that jail and prison are the worst places to try to overcome a drug addiction. When you're able to have proper treatment, have the support and love of the people who are closest to you, that's going to be much more effective.
Right. Eric, could you pick up on that and talk a little bit about the human element and the families, and maybe highlight one or two people that you write about in your book?
Sure. One of the principal characters is a woman named Debbie Priest, and her brother, who was a coal miner, Bull Priest, died of an OxyContin overdose. So I tried to intersperse her or weave that story with a journalistic part too. She actually had an interesting background that I didn't find out initially. It took me 2 or 3 visits to her house, but she had actually been convicted of drug dealing. Her family was part of a major corruption and drug ring back in the late 1990s. And so it was sort of this redemption story along with this, sort of Erin Brockovich story, because she's actually the one that sort of was the original whistleblower on all this. She, when I went to her house, she brought out a piece of paper, had names on both sides and where they were from, and there were more than 50, 60 names on that list. And she's like, these are all the people who had died of overdoses and I said, well, did you read about them in the paper? She said, no, these are like family and people that I've, talk to every day. I mean, these are families that and the most interesting thing or sad thing was that in many of these families, you'd have a brother and a sister die of an overdose, a mother and a son, a father and a daughter. So you had more than one drug overdose in, you know, a painkiller overdose in each family. So, you know, I sort of tracked her story along with her. Later in the book, one of her brothers dies, and then of course I mixed it in. There's a number of lawyers, really much like Chris's book. It was a large number of people involved, a community sort of banding together to take on, you know, some of the largest corporations in America.
And Chris, you cover, you include a lot of families and minors in your book, but you know, you specifically highlight one minor, and I wanted to give you, I wanted to get from you, know, your take on his story and help the readers understand the role that he played in Black lung benefits.
Yeah, it really, I mean, the reason that I wanted to do the book could be sort of summed up in the amazing two main characters who are John Klein and Gary Fox. And Gary Fox is the coal miner you mentioned, and he was born in in what is now Beckley, West Virginia. It was an old coal camp at the time, and basically was determined to, you know, make a better, more prosperous life for his wife and daughter, and ended up going to the mines and working for more than 30 years and contracting severe black lung, and ultimately was wrongfully denied benefits because of the withholding of medical evidence by the law firm that we've been speaking about. And I first heard about his story from the other main character in the book, who is John Klein, who I mentioned came from upstate New York as a sort of idealistic young volunteer, and eventually became a clinic worker, a medical clinic worker, carpenter, and then started taking on coal companies as a lay representative, and then went back to law school in his 50s to do this. And so it was really the intersection of those two men's stories when John takes Gary's case on and tries to pry loose from the law firm what information they'd previously withheld. And so it sort of epitomized both how we've failed to deliver on the two promises that we made to this nation's coal miners in 1969 through the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, which promised that basically we would essentially eradicate this entirely preventable disease, and that in the meantime we would provide modest, fair compensation to those who contracted it. And we've really not fully delivered on either promise. And Gary and John were the story of their fight against the coal industry and its doctors and lawyers. It really epitomizes that struggle. And I think it also gave me a lot of hope that sometimes the little guys basically can achieve some incredible things and occasionally win.
Thanks for that, Chris. And I want to let all three of you know, and the listeners and viewers know, that I think all three of these books would make excellent books for Appalachian Studies courses. We teach several courses at the university. I'm affiliated with Ohio University, one environmental health in Appalachia. But I also want to let Ben know that we're planning on using the fentanyl book in a class about environmental risks and societal benefits. So before, I want to make sure that we have some time for the writers who might be listening or viewing this session. And I just wanted to get some general sense from each of you about how you go about putting a project like this together. I mean, you do years and years of research. What do you use? Index cards? I don't know. Some sort of how do you put it all together? You know, and what kind of advice would you give a writer that wants to write about these important public and social health issues? And we'll throw it back to Ben and start there.
I think this is going to sound really boring, but organization is the key, and particularly having really thorough outlines. I have outlines for this book that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long, And it's just an attempt to organize my interviews with research I've done, with on-the-ground reporting, with other people's reporting. And, you know, you can't keep it all in your head, especially when you're working for all these years. And, you know, transcribing is very boring, but it helps you become one with the material. And another underrated thing I must say is just thinking. You know, we spend so much time like writing emails and hustling from here to there and reading, but sometimes just like asking yourself, what is this story really about? What am I trying to say here? Not, you know, a good book I don't think is just about one person or one idea. You know, it's about a theme. You know, what is the theme that we're working with here, and how do we communicate that? That's my advice.
Thanks. Eric, do you have other suggestions and advice for writers about how your process might apply?
Yeah, I mean, as a debut author, first book author, it's a big change from journalism, and I was very fortunate enough to have a good editor that kind of stitched the book together, because I wrote all these scenes and you know, sort of a bunch of news stories, and we've had to find some linkages, and I probably spent 3 or 4 months writing the book and about 8 months revising it. The revisions were almost more than when she turned in the, you know, suggested revisions, the editor, there was probably more than I had written in the book. It was that much. I think what really helps is knowing also what you're beginning and what you're ending, where you're going to go. And I tried, you mentioned about the cards. I mean, I saw that John McPhee article, or maybe it was a book, where he talks about all the cards, and I sorted those out and tried to reverse them and mix them up and shuffle them and put them back up. And at the end of the day, except for one small movement back in time, the editor suggested, just go with the chronology, Eric. It's a lot easier. Maybe for your second and third book, you can go for, you know, these complicated structures, but, you know, beginning to end, just go with the chronology. And the only place where I dropped back was when I dropped, as I mentioned earlier, going back into the conviction and imprisonment of the main character, Debbie Priest, because that was the one and only jump where I changed time and went back.
Right. So listen to your editor is another piece of advice, right?
Yeah, and get a good editor. Another piece of advice I'd have is I had like a copy editor working beyond the copy editor for the publisher. So, you know, I turned in, even though it wasn't structured and didn't have narrative arc, as I learned, I had to find out what narrative arc was. Mm-hmm. So, but at least I turned out clean grammatically, you know, grammatically and spelling, and clean copy, because I had a copy edited before I turned it in. So that's another
Thanks.
piece of advice.
Chris, how about you? How do you go about a project like this?
Well, it was interesting because this is my first book as well, and the process was certainly different. I got into journalism because I love writing originally, and so this was a real treat to be able to stretch as a writer. In my day job, you know, I'm mostly sort of functioning. When I'm reporting, I think of sort of functioning in two different parallel mindsets. You know, one is sort of an investigator, just gathering the facts, and then the second would be more of kind of a feature writer or storyteller, just kind of looking for the nuance or the character or the setting that sort of brings a story to life and humanizes it for people. And with this book, I certainly had to do a lot of the insane investigative work. So boxes and boxes of documents, invest in a good scanner that is portable. I put that to heavy use, organize things in folders, both digital and physical. But I also spent a ton of time for this book just going back to Southern West Virginia, or, you know, going with the principal character to his, you know, going to John Klein's hometown and just spending time with him in upstate New York. and looking for those little details, those little nuggets that came out in the book, or just being there in West Virginia to observe things, to go to a miner's funeral after he died of black lung. It's the little things like that that I think I invested quite a bit of time, maybe too much time in over the years, but I think those are the kinds of things that bring a book to life, and you have to invest time, and you don't necessarily know when those moments are going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I was lucky to get to be there for a lot of them, fortunately.
Right. Ben, are you working on anything else right now? I'm curious to hear from all of you about what your next project is, or you taking a break, or what other ideas do you have for stories that if you're not going to write, somebody else might want to follow through on? We'll start with Ben.
I was involved in the Big Brothers Big Sisters program and was assigned a little brother named Jarrell Cleveland in 2005. We were together for 11 years, and then he was murdered in 2016 near his home in Ferguson, Missouri, which is just outside of St. Louis. And he was classmates with Michael Brown, whose killing by a white police officer kind of fueled the Black Lives Matter movement. So Jarrell's murder went unsolved for all these years. So that's my next book. I actually have been investigating, and it actually figured out who killed him. So that book should be out in May 2022.
Okay. And Eric, what about you? Do you have another project that you're working on?
I'm back to daily journalism where I started, except now it's a new nonprofit news outlet. I left the Gazette Mail back in late March, and now we have a small nonprofit newsroom. I know it sounds crazy that we're trying to start it amid a pandemic, but so far so good. We have 4 reporters who have been provided by one reporter works for ProPublica, Ken Ward. But he's also helping us. And then we have 4 reporters from Report for America, which is a program much like Teach for America, where they bring emerging reporters into underserved areas. So I'm back to local news. Primarily, we've only been really up and running 2 months. And the first month, I've had to play the role of editor. We finally hired a managing editor, so I realize how hard editing is. I have a new respect for editors, but I'm going to get back to reporting. And we have a trial coming up, one of the major bellwether trials of the opioid litigation, the national opioid litigation, that's supposed to start later this month in about 2 or 3 weeks. Although I just right before this started, it seemed like there was going to be another possible delay as these major drug distributors who are being sued by a county and a city in our state have said that we can't hold the trial because of COVID-19.
And you brought up the news and going back to being a regular journalist, and I think that's another application for your book, is that you do weave the story of the newspapers throughout the book, and what happened with the newspapers. And that's almost like a whole nother book, I thought, writing about the politics and everything involved there. Do you want to say something about that for journalists that might
Sure,
be?
just briefly. I mean, I wrote it as a siren call for sustaining local news, particularly local watchdog news. There's incredible work being done by the New York Times and the Washington Post, but there's also really good work out there being done by the newspapers in the smaller communities. And I think we at the Gazette Mail at the time, proved that by, going toe-to-toe in court to try to expose some of the secrets and lies of these large companies. But even beyond that, the importance of somebody to cover the local school board, the local city council, the county commission. And as we all know, that local news is under siege, and there's been dozens of newspapers that have closed since even just this year. So it's a disturbing trend, and we're trying to meet or find solutions with this new nonprofit journalism model.
And Chris, what about you? Do you have another project on the horizon?
Well, I do, but first of all, I just want to second what Eric said. I mean, I'm such a fan of the work that they're doing at Mountain State Spotlight, and I think, you know, if you look at just go to the end notes if you're feeling particularly down, and look at the look at who I've cited in my book. I mean, yes, the Washington Post and the New York Times are in there, but I've cited so often the Charleston Gazette Mail and the Lexington Herald Leader and papers like that. And I'm really worried about what may happen if those news outlets go away. So it's very encouraging to me what Eric and his colleagues, Ken and other people are doing. And I think I will always want to continue reporting on coal in Appalachia to some degree. For now, I'm kind of pivoting to working on a project related to the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic in my day job. And I think, 6 years of basically of working on a book, including a year of just fact checking it, has kind of cured me of wanting to do another book for a while, but I'm sure that the itch will arise again at some point.
Thanks. And then I just wanted to go back and give each of you another opportunity to make, I don't want to say a sales pitch, but to maybe try to summarize the main message or main point that you were trying to make with this particular book. To broaden and to make sure that the people who are interested in the subject and who need to read this stuff will pick up your book and read it. So maybe kind of like the elevator speech, I don't know, but just, an opportunity for you to just give us another view of the important message of your work for this book in particular. So I'll throw it back to you, Ben, and see if you'd like to share something with us.
Well, first, I just wanted to spotlight Eric's work as well. And I referenced it as in my book as well. And it's really incredible what you were able to uncover. And we were all done a great service by it. Ultimately, Fentanyl Ink is a book about the human body in conflict with the human mind, is the way I like to put it. We're in the midst of the worst drug epidemic we've ever seen. We hear a lot about coronavirus, but in places like Missouri, where I'm from, as many people are still dying from opioids and fentanyl as corona today. And this problem isn't going away. In fact, it's getting worse. And what led us here is important, but also where we're going. And I speak a lot about what's known as harm reduction, which is basically the philosophy that we're not going to be able to stop people from using drugs. We might want them to, we might present a compelling case for them to, but throughout human history, people have used drugs, and it's not going to stop. The best we can hope to do is make it more safe for people to use drugs, so they know what they're taking, so that when they think they're taking meth, when they think they're taking cocaine or heroin, they're not actually taking fentanyl, something that will kill them immediately. And of course, treatment. We have incredible opioid treatments. We have Narcan, it's a miracle opioid overdose reversal drug. We have buprenorphine, naltrexone, all these amazing treatments for opioid use disorder. But it's a matter of mobilizing the money to the right places and getting the word out. And I'd like to think Fentanyl Ink tells the whole story.
Thank you, Ben. Eric, how about you?
Well, since Ben gave me a shout out, to give a shout out for him for being the most current. And, fentanyl, I think in Ben's book, he talks about, we really need to call it something different than the opioid crisis or a prescription pill crisis. It certainly has changed, and he's right about there being a surge of overdose deaths. And primarily, if you look at our statistic last year, and again, you know, for a while it was heroin, but now it's fentanyl, and they're mixing, Ben can talk about this better than I can, but they're mixing meth with fentanyl, and they're using pill presses with fentanyl and other prescription drugs that are ground up. So it's an incredible importance to understand what we're dealing with. A lot of times the reaction of legislatures, they're really like, you know, the clamp down on the prescription drugs in our state came like a decade too late. You know, they should have focused on, you know, the more pressing issues now. As far as my book, I kind of had the same goals as Chris. You know, I just wanted to, my idea was it was a story of resilience and redemption, and overcoming odds, sort of a David and Goliath tale. And like Chris said, sometimes the good guys can win, but occasionally, I think was the word that Chris used. So it can happen.
And Chris, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, it was interesting. You know, when I first, I remember when I wrote the proposal for this book and submitted it to publishers in 2014, I included in there, this is, you know, very explicitly, this is not a tale of good triumphing over evil or something like that. This is a tale of an ongoing injustice. And, you know, I don't want to make it seem like everything is great now, but it has been one of the really remarkable experiences of my career to be able to watch that calculation change from 2014 to the time that the book was actually finished. Because I think a lot of times reporters, you know, we spend most of our time reporting on things that go wrong, and injustices and things like that. And it's easy to think that that's the only thing that happens in the world. And, you know, this book was really inspiring to see, you know, working on this book and getting to spend time with these people and to see what some of the miners and their advocates were able to accomplish. And so I hope that people will take away from this book a sense that, you know, the struggle is constant and you never completely win, and there are steps forward and back, but you can sometimes achieve remarkable reforms with a small group of dedicated people over a very long period of time, showing dogged, determined activism.
Mm-hmm. And like all of you, I had a book that came out earlier this year as well, and it was interesting to release a book at this time in history. And I wonder if any of you had any thoughts on what it's like to have worked on a project for so long and feel like there's a really, really important substance and really important message that you want to get out to as many people as possible. But there are so many other really significant distractions happening in the world that, you know, I wonder how, if any of you want to comment on what it feels like to write a book and publish a book at this time, especially knowing how hard you worked to get it, you know, put it together, and you think the message is so important.
Well, as I mentioned, I went to Wuhan to do investigative reporting in these fentanyl companies, and no one back home had heard of Wuhan at the time. And now, of course, everyone has. And when coronavirus kicked off earlier this year, it really cut down the fentanyl supply chain in a lot of ways in a lot of parts of China. And so there was some kind of hope for a while that the drug was less available in the US and the prices were higher. But now that's sort of fallen away. The problem is worse than ever. And, you know, it's important to think about COVID not just as a problem unto itself. COVID in a lot of ways is making a lot of our public health problems even worse. And that, I think, has been my main takeaway.
Chris or Eric, do you have any thoughts on how contemporary times, how it's happening today, how you can how your message fits in, or the challenges that you see in trying to get your message across with all the distractions?
I guess I can speak a little bit to that. I had my whole book tour was canceled and everything, but compared to what everybody else is going through, Chris and I were talking this earlier. I'm even grateful that we had our books even published, because I mean it's a tough time for anything. But yeah, I mean there's a lot of different challenges. We're having to obviously do this over virtual instead of being there in person. Love to see you guys in person, but yeah. And then you have the shifting of you've got these, as kind of Ben's alluding to, you've got these dual crises now in Appalachia. We've got a war on two fronts, and some of the weaknesses of our healthcare system, mental health services, that sort of thing have really come to bear, and we're seeing that now with COVID-19, but they were also hollowed out by the opioid epidemic. So I don't want to end on a real sour note, but it does seem that there's at least 40 states that are reporting an increase in overdoses as people are isolated and lacking they say the opposite of addiction is connection, and there's not a lot of connection going on right now. So we'll see where it goes.
And yeah, I think that goes to Ben's point about the connection between COVID and other public health issues, right? And Chris, does black lung is continuing even and people still need treatment and still need benefits even in these times, and I wondered if you had some final thoughts on how the pandemic is affecting some of the messages that authors today are with these public health issues are trying to get in front of the public.
Yeah, I mean, black lung is still obviously a major issue. Levels of severe disease are at the highest that have ever been recorded, and COVID presents a particular risk to minors, for obvious reasons, if with their lungs compromised. But I think I completely agree with what Ben and Eric said, is that COVID has really shined a bright light on the many gaps in our public health infrastructure, and also on just the conditions that working men and women face on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure that I've written about labor for quite some time, and it's been a subject of great interest to me, but I've never seen as much interest as I have this year in things like meat packing plant conditions and things like that. And I'm hoping that concern for workers will be continued even after this crisis hopefully subsides at some point.
And as a public health professor, I'm psyched that everybody can pronounce epidemiologist now. So, and on that note, I think we're going to conclude the session. And I really thank you all very much for participating in this unusual book festival. And I encourage everyone to pick up these 3 books and read them all at the same time, because they may not seem like they're related, but they really are. And they're all excellent work.
Thanks to Chris, Eric, Ben, and Michele for their insights, and to our sponsor, the University of Pikeville. We also want to thank you for joining us for this 2020 Kentucky Book Festival online event. If you're interested in purchasing one of the books discussed today, please visit our independent bookstore partner, Joseph Beth Booksellers, at josephbeth.com. For a complete schedule of Kentucky Book Festival conversations, visit kyhumanities.org and follow us on social media at KY Humanities. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Bill Goodman.